Welcome, Voyager. Tonight, we slip into a story of stillness, of sails that drooped like sleeping wings, of ocean waters so calm they reflected the stars as if the sky had fallen in. We're heading toward a belt of blue so breathless and still, it seemed not like water, but glass. This is the tale of the doldrums, and of one ship caught in its hush in the year 1769. A voyage adrift not by storm, but by silence. And while we're gently adrift, let's take a moment to remember that history, like wind, only moves when someone gives it breath. So, if you're enjoying the channel, consider liking and subscribing, and drop your coordinates in the comments below. Let us know where you're listening from. If your harbor holds a forgotten tale, we might just sail there next. Now let your shoulders sink. Let the noise of the day drift off like foam from a bow. Listen for the soft creak of timbers, and feel the quiet tension of canvas hanging slack in the air. You are safe, you are held, and our story tonight sets sail at the very heart of the sea, in a place where wind forgets to move. The year is 1769, and the HMS Endeavour, commanded by a man named James Cook, is somewhere in the South Pacific near the equator. The crew is seasoned, the voyage scientific. Their mission is to observe the transit of Venus across the sun, to chart it precisely, to help calculate the vast distances between planets. But now they are stranded in the doldrums. This stretch of ocean, officially known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, girdles the Earth like a soft belt near the equator. It's a place where northern and southern trade winds meet, canceling each other out in a lull of warm, heavy air. The sea becomes a mirror, and ships can linger for days, even weeks, unmoving. To the men of the 18th century, there was no worse fate. The wind was their lifeblood, their engine, their only true propulsion. Without it, time became a weight. Rations grew lean, tempers short. The sun, unshielded by cloud or breeze, baked the decks until they shimmered. Tar boiled. Wood groaned. The sea didn't roar. It whispered, and that whisper was maddening. Sailors feared storms. Yes, but they feared the doldrums more. The storm had an end. Stillness did not. One diary from the Endeavour describes it simply. The ocean is like oil. The sails hang limp as prayer flags on a windless shrine. We have not moved in 2 days. It is as though the sea waits for us to forget what motion feels like. But even this calm held motion, if one looked closely. Under the glassy surface, flying fish darted like silver thoughts. Jellyfish bobbed as if suspended in an invisible syrup. And at night, the sea glowed faintly with bioluminescence, tiny marine organisms lighting up at the ship's passage, or even the wake of a tossed rope. Imagine now standing on that deck. No breeze, just sun, stars, and silence. The sky mirrored perfectly in the water below, so that you might forget which way was up. The men grew quieter each day. Some whispered that time itself had stopped. And perhaps, in a way it had. The doldrums were not merely a physical location. They were psychological. Sailors told tales of madness born from this stillness, of hallucinations, sirens, ghost ships glimpsed in heat shimmer. Some believed that these seas were haunted not by spirits, but by time unspooling too slowly. In truth, the doldrums were not supernatural. They were scientific. They formed from the convergence of trade winds, hot air rising and drawing moisture with it. Thunderclouds often loomed, but moved sluggishly. Rain fell in sudden bursts. Then the skies cleared to an eerie brilliance. But try telling that to a sailor whose barrel of water just ran dry. Many ships, especially in the age of sail, recorded long passages through these still zones. Some turned to desperate measures, rowing, even towing vessels with longboats. though such efforts did little. Others drifted for weeks, recording their frustrations in journals with ink that dried slower than their voyage. In 1852, the American clipper ship Flying Cloud became one of the fastest ships to sail from New York to San Francisco, doing so in just 89 days. But even she, built for speed, once lost a week to the doldrums. Her captain recorded that the sea lay flat as slate, no breath of wind, no cry of gulls, only our shadows, perfectly reflected, stretching out beneath us like ghosts. And yet, in all this stillness, there was beauty. Painters who journeyed through the tropics in the age of sail captured those eerie calm days in oils and sketches, wide mirror-like seas, pale cloudless skies, a single ship adrift like a forgotten thought. The doldrums had a palette of their own: pearl blue, whisper gray, gold at noon, violet by dusk. The sea could look like molten silver, or the belly of a storm, depending on the light and the birds. The tropics often host great wandering albatrosses and petrels. When windless, they too rest. At times, they float in groups, wings closed, as if dozing on the surface, waiting for the world to resume. On the Endeavour, Cook's men kept busy with repairs, scientific measurements, and careful observations. But even the act of recording time became strange when the environment refused to change. Noon arrived, but the sun had not moved in the sky. Or rather, the ship had not moved beneath it. There's a passage in the log where one of the naturalists, Joseph Banks, wrote of a dream he had during the lull, of walking across the ocean. The surface hardened to glass, and underneath, strange cities of coral and light, the ruins of forgotten ships, resting beside temples made of bone. Whether he dreamt it or hallucinated it, he never clarified, but such is the spell of the doldrums, a place where silence is loud, and the sea shows you not just your reflection, but your imagination. By the fifth day in the doldrums, the Endeavour's water barrels were half spent, and the daily ration of rum was thinner than usual, not out of cruelty, but caution. Cook knew these seas could hold a ship longer than anyone wanted to believe. There were tasks to pass the time, netting fish, resealing barrels, even stitching sails under the unchanging sun. But none of it filled the silence. The crew, even the younger lads who usually sang while they worked, had grown quiet. Voices seemed to echo in ways they didn't before, as if the sea absorbed the sound and whispered it back in strange tones. Cook himself remained vigilant, though not one to indulge in superstition. Even he noted in the log that these waters possess a strangeness I cannot rightly describe. He marked their position every morning and evening, though it rarely changed, the coordinates reading nearly the same day after day. At night, the world transformed. The sun dropped like a coin into the horizon, and stars filled the heavens with impossible clarity. No clouds, no wind, no motion, just a sky so full of constellations that it almost felt too close. Sailors lay on the deck, staring upward, and sometimes downward, seeing the same stars reflected in the water. And that was the strange thing. In the doldrums, the boundaries blur. Sky and sea, dream and wakefulness, the physical and the imagined. One midshipman swore he saw the constellation Orion, not above him, but beneath his feet. He bent over the gunwale and nearly tumbled in, trying to grasp a star that was really just his own reflection. But no one laughed, because they all understood. The doldrums played tricks, gentle ones mostly, but tricks nonetheless. During one dusk, the ship passed through a fog of jellyfish, their transparent bells glowing faintly with a ghostly green. The sailors watched as they pulsed beneath the surface like a drifting city of lanterns. One crewman described them as light caught in water, dancing without music. Even Cook paused to watch. These moments became sacred, small wonders in the vast monotony. When the ocean gives no wind, it gives quiet instead. And in that quiet, something awakens, an alertness, or perhaps a deeper kind of dreaming. Some sailors told stories to pass the time, old tales of ghost ships that never left the doldrums, of crews turned to statues, sails to stone, of ships that drifted forever, so perfectly mirrored by the sea that they forgot which world they came from. Others made up names for this stretch of water, the Mirror Sea, the ocean of forgotten breath. One even called it God's waiting room. And always, there was the hope of wind. Each morning the crew would test the lines, hang a piece of thread from the mast, watch for the twitch of a telltale. Every creak in the rigging was listened to carefully, as if the ship itself might whisper of change. On the sixth day a change did come. Not a gust, not yet, but a shift in color. The sky, pale and perfect for days, now showed streaks of pink at dawn. High cirrus clouds gathered at the edge of vision, like wandering thoughts coming back into focus, and the barometer dropped just a hair. To a modern eye, these are ordinary signs. To an 18th century sailor, they were proof that the world was beginning to turn again. That night, the stars seemed to tremble slightly in the water, not because they moved, but because the water did. A ripple, just one, barely enough to tip a floating feather. But it was real. The crew noticed, and they began to smile again subtly. Jokes returned, not loudly but in half-whispers. Even the cook made a louder clang in the galley. The next morning, the sails fluttered, and there it was, the breath. A faint one, yes, but a breath nonetheless. A breath of the earth, stirring from slumber. The sea was no longer glass, but liquid once more. The Endeavor began to move, not fast, not yet, but enough for the log to mark it, enough for the rudder to matter again, enough for the men to remember what it was to glide. But they would not forget the stillness. They would talk about it in ports for years, not in fear, but in wonder. The days where time stopped, where stars floated beneath their feet, where the sea turned to glass and offered a mirror not only to the sky, but to themselves. For as much as sailors feared the doldrums, many came to see it as a rite of passage. You do not leave such stillness unchanged, and neither do we. We often think of history as movement, voyages, discoveries, wars, but there is also a history of waiting, of being still, of listening deeply. The doldrums remind us that sometimes the world is not asking us to act, but to witness, to be very quiet, to look closely, to breathe. And when the wind returns, as it always does, we sail forward with a different heart, because we've been shown what lies beneath the motion, and it is vast, and it is luminous. The Endeavor caught wind slowly, like a creature remembering how to breathe after a long sleep. It didn't lurch forward, nor slice the water with hunger. It eased gently, like a thought resuming its course after pausing to admire a dream. As the sails filled, taut with the first breeze in days, the crew stood quietly. No cheers, no loud claps on the back, just the sound of ropes shifting, timbers groaning in relief, and the sigh of fabric stretching toward movement. They had left the mirror behind, but it clung to them still. Even days later, once the ship was well into the southern trades, some spoke of it. The stillness, the silence. One sailor, a superstitious man from Devon, swore the sea had spoken to him during that breathless drift, not in words but in feelings, as if the ocean, bored of being a road, wanted for once to be a window. Another said he saw the ghost of a sailor walk across the water at night, not sinking, just strolling on the stars. He meant it more as poetry than warning, but no one laughed. Not after what they'd seen. The doldrums have that effect. They are not a place to fear, but to be humbled by. And for sailors of the 18th century, they weren't just a meteorological inconvenience. They were a test, a reminder that man did not command the sea. He only asked permission to cross it. In later years, Cook's journals from that voyage were studied by naturalists and meteorologists alike. He wrote of the unbroken horizon, the strange animals they encountered, and the oppressive lack of wind with the calm, precise voice of a scientist. But even in his measured tone, there is awe. On one of the final pages detailing their time near the equator, he wrote, "We were becalmed for near 10 days. In that time, not a breath stirred the sails. The sea lay smooth as polished marble, the sky unblemished. The stars reflected to such clarity I feared to look too long. One could mistake the heavens for a second ocean, and the ocean for the sky. There is a holiness in that stillness I will not soon forget." Holiness, not a word used lightly in such journals. But what else could it be called? For the sea is not always storm and fury. Sometimes it is cathedral silence, a hush so deep it reaches past memory, past thought, into something more primitive, the awe of the infinite. Centuries later, when satellites would finally peer into the ever-shifting bands of the intertropical convergence zone, they would reveal columns of rising warm air, torrential rains, chaotic thunderstorms. The doldrums, as it turns out, are not always calm, but for those who pass through them at just the right time, they are a mirror to everything. The place where the sea turns to glass remains in the collective memory of every sailor. It is a moment held like a pressed flower in the pages of history, fragile, perfect, and true. And though today engines hum and GPS sings its coordinates with confidence, the sea is not fooled. The still remembers. It remembers the breathless days when ships became motionless sculptures, when men listened to the air and water like monks awaiting revelation. It remembers the jellyfish lanterns, the stars that mirrored, the ripples that never came. It remembers being a sky. And if you, dear listener, ever find yourself drifting on a windless sea, or perhaps in your own life, caught in a moment of stillness, remember what the sailors of the Endeavour learned in 1769. That waiting is not wasting, that silence can reveal more than sound, and that sometimes the greatest journeys happen not in miles, but in minutes, not in movement, but in pause. So as you lie back now, perhaps beneath your own ceiling of stars, or simply in the quiet of your room, let the air be still. Let the moment stretch. There is no need to move just yet. Let the sea turn to glass around you, and see what reflections rise. There might be stars beneath your feet. There might be dreams ahead on the horizon. But for now, there is only the hush, and the gentle creak of timbers as the tide of sleep begins to carry you. Welcome the stillness. Let it hold you, and sleep well, voyager. You've weathered the calm just fine. Welcome, voyager. Tonight we sail into mist, into a story of sailors and storms, and a pale light that flickered where no lighthouse stood. They called it a phantom beacon, glowing faintly just above the waves. It was said to appear only before terrible weather, hanging in the Baltic fog like a warning whispered in light. Some believed it was a trick of the eyes, others a blessing from the drowned. But many followed it anyway, drawn to that soft shimmer the way moths find flame, or ships find ruin. Now, you might say that trusting a ghostly glow in the middle of a gale sounds like a poor navigational strategy. But this was long before radar, before satellite charts. Back then, the sea kept most of its secrets and gave only hints in return. Before we begin the slow unraveling, now's a fine moment to like this voyage and subscribe to our channel. Keeps the lantern lit for future tales. And if you'd be so kind, drop a coordinate in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? If your harbor holds a haunting or a hush of history, it might just drift into a future episode. Now ease yourself back. Let your thoughts settle. Imagine waves lapping gently against the hull, the sway of hammocks, the scent of rope and wood warmed by brine. Relax. Let the tides pull gently on your thoughts. Our story begins in the early 1800s, somewhere off the coast of Finland. A Swedish merchant ship, the Allegoria, was making its winter run across the northern Baltic, her hull heavy with iron ore, pine pitch, and salted herring. The sea, glassy at midday, began to curdle with cold as night fell. Snow whirled down from a sky so low it felt like the heavens had stooped to listen. The captain, one Henrik Lonrot, was a man of few words and fewer doubts, but even he felt uneasy when the barometer dropped like a stone. By midnight, the wind had vanished completely. The sea lay flat, black, and unbroken, like obsidian poured smooth over the earth. And that's when a cry went up from the foredeck. Light, off starboard. Lonrot climbed to the rail, squinting into the murk, and there it was, a faint golden pulse, far away but unmistakable, hanging where no lighthouse should have been. It blinked once, twice, then held, low and steady. The crew whispered. Some crossed themselves. Others muttered about the old tales, the ghost light, the warning. But Lonrot, ever practical, said only, "Change course. We'll steer to port. Give it wide space." They did. By dawn, the sky had broken loose. A nor'easter rolled in with claws. Waves reared like black beasts and slammed the decks. But the Allegoria stayed afloat, battered but intact. And by noon the next day, she limped into Turku harbor, her sails in ribbons and her hull leaking cold. Later, over mugs of boiled beer and dry bread, sailors from other ships told of vessels lost that same night, just a few miles off the route they themselves had chosen, right where the light had glowed. That tale was not unique. From the 18th through the early 20th century, Baltic sailors reported sightings of a spectral glow that rose over the sea just hours before violent storms. Some claimed it hovered like a lantern, others that it moved, bobbing like a buoy in the sky. Came to be called the stormlight or stormlight. Theories abounded. Some said it was St. Elmo's fire, the luminous plasma discharge that dances along masts during electrical storms. Others thought it was caused by phosphorus in the water, stirred up by unusual wave patterns. Some whispered of Viking spirits, guarding their watery domains. But among the older mariners, the light wasn't feared, it was followed. You see, most of the Baltic coastlines were treacherous, jagged fjords, hidden reefs, shifting sands. Before standardized lighthouses, navigation was more art than science. Charts were hand-drawn, and even local captains sometimes lost their bearings in the snow-flecked dark. So when a light appeared, even one that shouldn't be there, it was a thing to consider carefully. If you ignored it and sailed into trouble, the blame was yours. But if you altered course and were saved, well, who was to say it hadn't been a gift? By the 1830s, sightings of the phantom light were frequent enough to earn entries in ship's logs. A Prussian frigate recorded, observed a luminous body near Gisaro. No known beacon at that site. Altered bearing. Severe storm followed within 8 hours. In 1847, a Russian vessel detailed. Captain Konstantin Gurov noted a fixed glow to the southeast. Chose to tack inland. Storm surge claimed 3 fishing boats in the area we avoided. No one knew exactly what it was, but many learned to respect it. It became a sailor's superstition, yes, but a strangely useful one. Less a legend than a practical ghost. That's a rare thing, Voyager. A superstition that might have saved lives. Now let's drift back even farther. To a time before nations, before charts, before the very idea of a lighthouse. The Baltic was once the edge of the known world. Cold, deep, and capricious. The Sami people spoke of spirits in the water, beings of mist and fire who warned travelers in strange ways. Some carried carved talismans, tiny oiled stones believed to catch and reflect warning lights sent by these entities. One such stone, found in a grave near Ulu, is etched with a spiral that glows faintly when held under candlelight. Some say it mimics the storm light's pulse. And in medieval Norse tales, there are fragments of verses, barely remembered, about a golden eye that weeps light before the storm god's fury. Whether metaphor or memory, no one can say for sure. Still, the idea endures. A kind light, a warning glow, something seen only in danger's shadow. As modern science marched forward, belief in the phantom lighthouse began to wane. By the 1920s, with the installation of electric beacons, radio signals, and standardized buoys, fewer sailors reported the light. It receded into folklore, something half remembered by old men on bar stools, their fingers tracing knots into wood as they whispered about the time the light saved their lives. But every so often, even now, it returns. A Finnish trawler in 1994 noted an unexplained light east of Hanko. No source was found. A naval cadet in 2003 swore he saw a flicker over the Gulf of Bothnia, just minutes before an unseasonal storm rolled in. Reports remain rare, but they still appear. Always before the wind, always before the waves, always alone. As we leave behind the 19th century decks and creaking timber of those early merchant ships, the sea begins to stir again with questions, not answers. What was the phantom lighthouse? Could it truly have been a natural phenomenon, mistaken phosphorescence, a refracted sunbeam, and atmospheric distortion? Or did it belong to that slim category of truths we see just once, but remember forever, like dreams that are too specific to be invented? Some physicists, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, attempted to explain it through the lens of superior mirages, also known as fata morgana. These occur when layers of cold and warm air over the sea bend light in such a way that distant objects appear closer, higher, or more luminous than they are. A real lighthouse, hidden behind the curve of the earth, might seem to float above the horizon, glowing softly where none should be. But the sailors who followed it didn't believe it was a mirage, and many claimed there was no known lighthouse at all in the direction of the glow, only waves and ruin. Some said it hovered low and golden. Others said it pulsed blue, like a lantern seen through fogged glass. One rare account from 1882 describes it as a thin vertical beam, as though a line had been drawn in the sky from sea to stars. Still others describe it as a presence. Captain Theodore Nielsen of the schooner Estrella told of it in his later years, half lost in memory, half trying to convince his grandson it had truly happened. "We were 4 days from Kalmar," he said, headed toward Riga. The air felt wrong, too still, no gulls, no wind. Then, in the dark, came a glow, just off the bow, like a candle under water. Only it wasn't wet. It was there in the fog, floating. His grandson asked, "What did you do?" Captain Nielsen whispered, "We followed it, not toward it, but alongside, like pacing it, like keeping company. And then, the sea tore open. That night, he said, they made it into harbor an hour ahead of schedule. The storm arrived just minutes behind them. I don't know what it was, the old man said, looking away, but it wanted us safe. And so it was that this mysterious light came to inhabit two worlds, fact and folklore. You see, the Baltic Sea is no stranger to contradiction. It is both inland and oceanic, salty and fresh, bordered by countries who once warred and now trade, home to stony Viking ruins and glass and steel ports. The sea has seen empires rise and collapse into its tides. Denmark, Sweden, Prussia, Russia each tried to control it, and each in time failed to fully tame its currents. Yet the phantom light never bowed to borders. It was seen by Swedish traders, Finnish fishermen, Polish smugglers, German U-boats, and once, even a British mail steamer in 1901. And while its appearance changed slightly from tale to tale, what never changed was this: it came before storms. And so, we return to the notion of kindness. How rare it is that folklore gives us a ghost not born of vengeance or punishment, but one that warns, that watches, that seems to care. Of course, not everyone believed in kindness at sea. Some said the light was a trickster spirit, leading ships astray on purpose, guiding them toward the very rocks they hoped to avoid. In some Latvian fishermen's tales, the Jugendsvans, or fire devil, appeared as a floating light before a storm and must be cursed aloud or ignored, lest it pull your vessel down into the cold. But those stories always ended with sailors chasing the glow directly. Those who observed from a distance and adjusted their course without greed or fear. They survived. Perhaps that's the lesson. It wasn't the light itself, but how you treated it. Sailors who tried to catch it, lost it. Those who respected its distance and changed their course humbly were spared. There's something ancient about that truth, not just nautical but deeply human. Sometimes the thing that warns you doesn't want to be seen up close. It wants to be understood from afar, not grasped, not owned, not turned into a monument, just heeded. Now let's drift to another time. During the First World War, the Baltic became a mine-laced chessboard. German and Russian vessels skirted each other in a silent, deadly dance. Communication was limited. The fog, ever present. In 1916, a German mine layer, the SMS Albatross, was making a quiet approach to lay explosive charges near the Gulf of Finland. The night was cold, visibility low. A junior officer recorded in his logbook. An odd shimmer noted near portside horizon, not from our lance. No known lighthouse within this bearing. The captain, skeptical, altered course by 15 degrees. The fog thickened. The light vanished. The mines, it turned out, had drifted. Had the Albatross continued on its intended path, it would have sailed directly over them. After the war, that officer returned to that same stretch of water, aboard a civilian ferry. He never saw the light again, but he kept the logbook. And in the margins, years later, he wrote, "Not all warnings need explanation. Some just need listening." Now, Voyager, I invite you to close your eyes, if you haven't already. Imagine that quiet sea. The way the fog folds gently over your shoulders. The slow rock of the boat beneath your thoughts. No wind, no sound. Then softly, a glow. Far ahead, low, pale, waiting. You adjust your course just slightly. The wheel creaks in your hands. A few degrees to starboard, and you keep moving gently through the dark. The Baltic, you see, is a sea that holds memory like the shore holds driftwood. It piles it up quietly, day after day, century after century, until some unsuspecting foot uncovers something ancient beneath the sand. And among those memories is the glow. The phantom lighthouse never had coordinates. No fixed longitude, no known keeper, no registered structure. But its appearances were catalogued the same way the wind is described, repeated, passed down. Not by scientists, but by those who watch the horizon more carefully than most. Sailors. And when the 20th century gave way to satellite beacons, to weather balloons, to barometric graphs and radar, many believed the light would disappear, that it was no longer needed. But there are still reports. One came in 2003 from a Finnish marine biologist working off the Åland archipelago. The research vessel Pelagia was studying jellyfish blooms. It was late, nearly midnight, and the team had paused their sampling due to unseasonal fog. The crew gathered near the stern to take readings. That's when the intern saw it. She thought at first it was a spotlight from a nearby ferry, but there were no other ships, no sound, just a pulse of pale amber, sitting low above the waterline. She called to the others, but by the time they looked, the glow had vanished. Still, the biologist noted a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, followed hours later by a gale that blew out 2 of their observation buoys. Coincidence, perhaps, but they altered course, returned to harbor early, and the ship remained intact. In her published notes, the biologist wrote, almost as a footnote, "Strange anomaly witnessed on September 6, 2003. Low altitude luminescence. No known source. Perhaps an echo of older warnings. Isn't it strange how something that never built itself with brick or steel can feel more permanent than a real lighthouse? Because even the real ones have fallen, swept away by time, tide, or politics. But the phantom persists. You see, not every truth wears a uniform. Some slip through cracks in our certainty and hover there, quiet and glowing. And the phantom lighthouse has one final trait to share. It never called attention to itself. It didn't scream or flash or siren. It was a whisper of light, just enough to turn the wheel by a few degrees. A gentle nudge, a silent companion. In this way, it was unlike most warnings we're given in life. Trusted you to notice, and maybe that's why it lingers so vividly in the stories of those who saw it. Because what is a phantom, really, but something half remembered and half true? Something that matters enough to stay in the sea's vocabulary? Even today, in maritime folklore circles and sailors' bars in Stockholm or Tallinn, you'll hear it brought up, always with a little hesitation. Have you seen the light? The question is not about seeing something with your eyes. It's about whether you'd believe a glow without a source, whether you'd adjust course without certainty, and whether, just maybe, you'd be grateful for something that came not to frighten but to save. In that way, the phantom lighthouse feels more like a mirror, not one made of glass, but of decision. How do we treat the warnings that come gently? Do we heed them or chase them? Do we deny them because they're too quiet? Or do we alter our path even slightly, just in case the sea knows something we don't? And as we drift to the shore of sleep, consider this. The lighthouse was never fixed, but its purpose was to guide, to warn, to care invisibly. There's poetry in that, because perhaps the greatest kindness is not in shouting, but in shining, just enough to be noticed, then fading once the course is safe. So rest now, voyager. Let your thoughts rock gently, like a hull in calm water. Feel the faint salt on your lips, the hush of fog closing around the edges of the world. Somewhere far off, a lantern glows for you. You don't need to find it, only trust it. Thank you for sailing with me tonight, through storms remembered and lights unseen. If your coordinates have brought you this far, leave them below, in the comments. Tell me where the waves meet your window, where your ship has anchored tonight, and if your coast holds a tale, a lighthouse that isn't on any map, perhaps we'll drift there together, in another story. Until then, sleep well, and let the sea keep you. Welcome, voyager. You've arrived just in time for tonight's drift. A gentle voyage into legend, breath, and saltwater mist. Our story floats in that delicate space between myth and map, where sailors once swore by what they saw, and sometimes by what they only thought they saw. This tale begins on calm waters, in the soft belly of the Arabian Sea, where the line between sea and sky blurs like a half-remembered dream. Here, men once sailed past islands that were not islands. They dropped anchor on green shores that swayed beneath their feet, lit fires on beaches that exhaled, and sometimes, just as the stew began to bubble, the ground began to shift, and the island began to swim. Yes, tonight's tale is about the whale that carried a forest on its back. And if you're thinking that sounds far-fetched, you're not alone. But before you laugh the legend overboard, remember that the sea keeps its secrets well, and the boundary between folklore and fact is often only as deep as a tide pool. Before we dive in, let me gently ask you to like this video and subscribe to our quiet corner of the ocean. It helps our tiny ship stay afloat, charting tranquil courses through forgotten histories. Drop your coordinates in the comments. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Perhaps there's a phantom island off your coast too. If so, we just might sail there next. Now settle in. Let the hush of dusk wrap softly around you. Imagine the creak of ropes above, the slow roll of a ship's wooden belly, the way the stars blink awake one by one. Let your breath follow the tide, slow and low. And now, let us begin. Our story tonight sets sail somewhere between Oman and Gujarat in the late 14th century. The air is warm, the water is flat as brushed steel, and a dhow, slender, elegant, made for trade and tale, moves lazily over the current. Aboard this dhow is a merchant named Al-Fahim, a man who has crossed the Indian Ocean more times than he can count. He has traded spices in Zanzibar, copper in Calicut, incense in Socotra. But even a seasoned sailor such as he will soon find himself humbled by something too large to record in ledgers. They spot the island just after dawn. It seems ordinary enough. Lush, low, rimmed with black stone and pale mangroves. A few seabirds will overhead. There is even a trickle of fresh water down one slope, a blessing in a salty world. The crew cheers softly. Land means rest, warmth, the chance to cook rice without brine. They lower anchor, though the water seems oddly deep for a coastal stop. But hunger trumps doubt. Al-Fahim, curious, rows ashore with 2 men and a small stove. The ground feels strange underfoot, resilient, slightly warm. Still they unpack, set kindling, light a flame. The moment the pot begins to simmer, the island shudders. The start small, a groan like wood yawning in a storm, then a tilt. The men stumble, the ground sways, and then, impossibly, it begins to rise. The mangroves slide backward. The shoreline arcs into motion. A massive eye, black, reflective, ancient, breaches the surface just beyond the bow. Al-Fahim drops his bowl. What they had taken for an island was alive. A whale, larger than any described by travelers. Its barnacle back covered in years of silt, algae, even saplings. Somehow, it had lain sleeping long enough for a small forest to take root on its spine. And now, disturbed by flame or footstep or fate, it was awake. The sailors scream, scramble, leap back into the boat. The dhow reels as the island dives, sending up a spout that catches the morning light and makes a rainbow across the sail. They do not land again for 3 days. Such tales, strange as they sound, are not unique. They echo across centuries and coasts. Arab sailors told of Zarafa al-Bahr, or sea giraffes, immense and strange. Sinbad himself is said to have once built a fire on an island that turned out to be the back of a giant fish. In Western medieval texts, these creatures became aspidocolones, sometimes whales, sometimes turtles, always dangerous in their deception. What did they mean, these stories? Perhaps they were warnings. The sea gives much, but punishes presumption. Do not assume the still thing is safe. Do not mistake silence for stability. Or perhaps they were simply metaphors. The world, after all, is always shifting. What seems solid today may slip tomorrow. Even islands can swim. But there's something else to consider. These stories might not be so imaginary after all. You see, whales, particularly the blue whale and the sperm whale, can grow vast enough to resemble land from a distance, especially when surfaced and still. Their backs host entire ecosystems. Barnacles, remeras, algae. In some regions, seabirds nest atop them, resting mid-journey. And though they do not sleep for hours, they do drift, semi-conscious, through calm waters. A whale at rest might appear to be a fixed point, especially to tired eyes, or to men from faraway lands unfamiliar with such creatures. There are real accounts, too. In 1833, a ship's log from the brig Isabella noted an unusual event off Madagascar. They wrote of a hummock of land, greenish in hue, that vanished when approached. Only later, through spyglass, did they realize it had been a whale, one longer than 3 masts, with kelp streaming from its flukes. And in 1870, a Portuguese captain swore under oath that his vessel had collided with what he believed to be a small islet, until it dived beneath them, nearly capsizing the stern. So maybe the sailors weren't dreaming. Maybe they just met something bigger than belief. And in time, the story grew. In the years that followed Al-Fahim's near encounter with the swimming island, he retold the tale often, at ports and markets, in the shadow of minarets and the warmth of lantern-lit tea houses. The story unfurled like sailcloth in wind. Each telling swelled slightly more. The whale grew longer, the forest denser, and the birds that roost in its mangroves began to speak, repeating the sailor's words like mocking parrots of the sea. And people listened, not because they believed every word, but because something about the ocean's vastness made such impossibilities feel almost plausible. After all, the sea has never been known for its realism. Curves horizons and shifts truths with every wave. In the centuries before sonar and satellite, the sea was a dream you had to navigate by gut and ghostlight. You watched birds, you read the stars, you measured distance in cups of water left and how long your crew had gone without singing. So when a merchant says he landed on an island that turned out to be alive, it's less a lie than a kind of poetic truth. It captures the instability of the world out there, where even the floor beneath your feet might betray you, might stir and dive and leave you flailing in disbelief. Let us drift eastward now, past Muscat, past the Horn of Africa, toward the deeper roots of the tale. Arab seafarers weren't the only ones to whisper of moving islands. On the other side of the Indian Ocean, in the folklore of the Malay archipelago, we find tales of Pulau Hanyu, drifting islands, places that appear on the horizon only to vanish. The Orang Lot, the sea people of these waters, believed such lands were alive, either the backs of slumbering beasts or enchanted by spirits who refused to be mapped. One such tale tells of a man who, lost in a typhoon, stumbled upon a palm-fringed shore that offered him coconuts and shade. He thanked the gods, fell asleep in the sand, and awoke to find himself at sea again, clinging to a whale's back as it sank into the depths. The island had left him behind, a warning perhaps to never take safe ground for granted. And then there's the curious case of the roc, the mythical bird said to be so large it could carry off elephants. In Marco Polo's travels and later in the Arabian Nights, sailors confuse whales for islands, and islands for birds, and birds for storms. In the old world, to err in observation wasn't just human, it was expected. Nature was a shapeshifter. But let us return to the Arabian Sea, to Al-Fahim's dhow, now weeks past the encounter. They sail slower now, more watchfully. Each dark mass on the horizon is eyed with suspicion, each shadow beneath the keel imagined into life. The men speak less. Al-Fahim, however, finds himself altered, not frightened, not ashamed, but quieted. He writes in his log, "The sea reminds us that stillness is not the same as safety, that sometimes the gentlest humps hold the greatest force, that wonder is often buried beneath barnacle." Centuries later, natural historians would collect these tales, unsure where to shelve them, under fantasy, perhaps, or the early anthropology of fear. But even in the scientific age, echoes of these stories resurface. In 1966, a Soviet whaling ship named Vostok 2 recorded sonar readings of a seafloor rise off Socotra that later rose another 14 meters. The anomaly, when approached, gave off a strange pulsing sound, and the crew noted that seabirds congregated in circular patterns above it, diving but never touching down. No one could confirm what it was. The report faded into archives. A myth? A glitch in the equipment? Or just another whale, ancient and resting, letting algae decorate its back like green armor? And why do we care so much whether it was real? Perhaps because the idea of a sleeping island stirs something in us, a comfort, even, that the world still has mysteries large enough to lie beneath our feet unnoticed. That maybe, just maybe, not everything needs to be explained. A forest on a whale's back. What could be more quietly profound? Imagine it. Roots sunk into skin thicker than stone. Trees swaying over lungs the size of chambers. Birds nesting in the hollows of a living mountain. Unaware they're riding a giant who dreams in blue. And underneath it all, the slow, deep song of the whale. Low as the ocean's memory. Long as a legend. A lullaby for the earth. We don't know how many such creatures might have existed, or if they ever did. But the maps suggest that mariners believed something was out there. In the margins of early charts, alongside dragons and krakens, you'll find curious island-like forms, unlabeled, oddly mobile, surrounded not by reefs but by waves drawn to suggest motion. In the Kitab al-Buldan, the 10th century geography of Ibn al-Faqih, there's a passage describing an island that doth heave and sink with the tides, and upon it are birds that never leave, for it feeds them. He doesn't call it a whale, but he doesn't call it land either. And on a 15th century map by Ahmad al-Kalkashandi, a strange oval mass drifts just south of the Malabar coast, covered in vines and flagged with the note, "Beware, for it is not as it seems." Maybe these were inventions, or maybe they were the cautious scribblings of men who had seen more than they could make sense of. Because in truth, what is a whale but an island that breathes? It offers rest, shade, fish circling in its slipstream. It can host life, and like the best islands, it moves only when it must. Some marine biologists today note that large whales, like the blue whale or the fin whale, accumulate entire miniature biomes on their bodies. Certain barnacles grow nowhere else. Lice, specific to whales, migrate with their hosts. When these creatures die, they fall to the ocean floor and become whale falls, deep-sea ecosystems that nourished countless others for decades. Even in death, the whale becomes a home. So perhaps it's not strange to imagine one as an island. The sea, after all, doesn't care about categories, and the men who once sailed it learned not to care either. What mattered was respect, observation, story, and stories, as you've seen, sometimes outlive even the greatest waves. Our tale nears its end, but before it does, we drift a little further, just as the sailors of old once did. Not toward a destination, but into something slower, wider, quieter. Imagine now that you are aboard Al-Fahim's vessel. Night has fallen, the sails are tied, and the ship rocks gently, as if cradled by the hands of the sea itself. Above, stars shimmer like silver pollen caught in a breeze. Below, the water is velvet dark, broken only by flecks of phosphorescence stirred by fish darting beneath the hull. You are half asleep at the rail, the warm wood against your cheek. The night smells of salt and clove and distant cooking fires from a place you passed many days ago. And somewhere out there is the island that isn't an island. A shiver of moonlight touches the horizon, and for a moment, you see it again, or think you do. A rise in the water, a swell too steady to be wave, a patch of forest etched against the sky. No movement, no sound, save the wind whispering through palm fronds perched impossibly in the open ocean. You hold your breath, but as clouds slip across the moon, the shape softens, flattens, vanishes. Just water again. But you remember, you always will, and you are not alone in that, because these stories wove their way through generations, through spices traded in Zanzibar, pearls lifted from the Gulf, ivory carved in the Horn, and stories exchanged over date wine and old maps. In each retelling, the whale shifts. It becomes larger, older, deeper in magic. Sometimes it sings storms into being. Sometimes it is the last of its kind, wandering in search of another like it. Sometimes it is the spirit of a drowned island, reborn into movement. But always it carries the forest on its back. Always it offers shelter, and always it disappears before the world can name it. That, perhaps, is the nature of wonder. Cannot be summoned, only stumbled upon, and then just as suddenly gone. The forests of the Arabian Sea are real, of course. The mangroves of Qatar and the Khor al-Udaid. The tidal channels of Gujarat, where roots knit the water and mud into a latticework of green and silver. These places teem with life and echo with the calls of storks and kingfishers. But they do not drift. They do not sigh. They do not carry legends beneath their trunks. Or so we believe. There are echoes of the whale island in other parts of the world, too. In Norse mythology, there is Lingbacker, the heatherback, a sea creature so large it was mistaken for land, covered in grass and birds. When sailors landed to rest and light fires, the beast would dive, dragging them into the cold. And in ancient Irish lore we find Jasconius, a fish mistaken for an island by St. Brendan and his monks. They built altars on its back, only to leap into boats when it began to move. Even the Bible whispers of such beasts, Leviathan, scaled and writhing, dwelling beneath unknowable depths. It is as if every coast, every seafaring people, once asked the same question. What lies just beneath the surface? What ancient intelligence waits, unnoticed, watching? And more importantly, would we recognize it as life or mistake it for land? Now let us look gently at the map again. Picture a medieval chart, hand-inked and yellowing. The edges are alive with monsters, serpents and kraken and strange snout beasts with coiling tails. But there, tucked near the Arabian Sea, you see it. An unlabeled shape, oddly symmetrical. Not quite an island, not quite a reef. You wonder who drew it. Someone who had heard the story? Someone who had seen it for themselves? Or someone, perhaps, who dreamed of it? Who longed for a world where the ocean still held secrets, and where a creature could drift for centuries, unnoticed except by poets and cartographers. And what if it's still out there, not as a whale perhaps, but as the idea of a whale, a floating place, a shelter for the wandering, a promise that the earth still has softness, a reminder that in a world of sharp edges, there might still be something that gives, that sways, that remembers birdsong and lets forests bloom on its back. So the next time you look out to sea, especially in the hours just before dawn, when the water is calm as polished slate, and the line between air and ocean begins to blur, pause. Watch for a hump, a rise, a distant patch of green. It may not be land, it may not be beast, But it might just be both. A mystery meant not to be solved, but cherished. A story like this one meant not to be proven but passed along. Now, Voyager, rest easy. Let the tide of this tale carry you gently toward dreams, where islands drift, whales breathe beneath forests, and the stars whisper secrets to those who wait just long enough to hear them. Sleep well, and should you find yourself upon a strange green island with soft soil and still air, dig gently. You might be standing on the back of something ancient and kind and quietly watching. Good night, Voyager. Until the next tide. Welcome, Voyager. Tonight we dream with maps. Paper ones, fragile and gold-rimmed, curling at the corners, inked with continents still guessing their own names. Some say maps tell us where we are, but the best ones remind us where we've been, and who dared to imagine more. This is the story of Abraham Ortelius, a quiet man with a cartographer's quill and a dream too big for his century. He stitched the first modern atlas together in 1570, and between its folded pages, the earth itself began to shift. Literally, you see, Ortelius believed something strange. He thought the continents once touched, that Africa, South America, Europe, even the poles, once huddled like puzzle pieces and then drifted. He suggested this not with earthquakes or science, but with the dreamlike intuition of someone who had stared too long at a map and started to notice the shapes whispered to each other. Tonight, we'll trace the drifting edges of this story, float between parchment and tectonics, and maybe, just maybe, follow the dream of a man who once imagined the world before it fell apart. Before we drift too far, remember to like this video and subscribe. If stories like this help you drift away, drop a coordinate in the comments, just a latitude and longitude, and tell us where you're listening from. If the winds are right, your shore may feature in a future tale. Now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders fall, listen for the soft creak of leather bookbindings and the rustle of pages in a dimly lit study. The globe spins gently beside a candle. The sea, in the distance, is quiet. Let the world slow down, let it dissolve, and let us begin. Our story tonight sets sail in Antwerp, in the year 1570, a port city, fat with spices, silver, and scandal. Ships came here from Lisbon, Seville, and the edge of the known world, and within its canals and counting houses lived a man who rarely left his desk, Abraham Ortelius. He was born in 1527, a time when the shape of the earth was still being negotiated. The Renaissance had cracked open old certainties, but so much remained uncertain. Maps were inconsistent, crowded with guesses. Some showed sea monsters curling near Iceland. Others drew India like a duck's foot. But Ortelius was meticulous. He worked first as an illuminator, a colorist, for books and maps. He'd take outlines from other men and bring them to life with lapis blues and brick red coastlines. Over time, though, he began to collect more than pigments. He gathered maps themselves, scores of them, by different makers, different styles, different visions of the world. He noticed slowly that no two matched. It bothered him. What if, he thought, you could bring them together, standardize them, cross-reference one coastline against another, trim the flourishes, drop the monsters, and keep only what fit the evidence? That idea would become the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, theater of the world, the first modern atlas. Published in 1570, it included 70 maps compiled from sources across Europe. Ortelius didn't claim to discover them. Rather, he curated, organized, annotated. His genius wasn't in the drawing of new lands, but in seeing the bigger picture, literally. In doing so, he became something rare, a cartographer of cartographers. But tucked quietly inside his annotations, in the back pages of his life's work, was a strange note, one that would puzzle geologists centuries later. He wrote gently, cautiously, that the shapes of the continents were too similar to be coincidence, that Africa and South America seemed to belong together, that the Americas appeared to have been torn away from Europe and Africa by some ancient catastrophe. He didn't call it plate tectonics. That wouldn't come until the 20th century. He didn't use seismic data or fossil evidence. He didn't even insist he was right. But he saw it, the fit, the idea, a sleeping theory, buried inside a book of maps. And then, forgotten for centuries, Ortelius' world was not ready to drift. His time was about fixing place, not questioning it. Monarchs ruled by divine right. Boundaries were sacred. The earth had corners. It had pillars. Atlantis had sunk. Sure, but the continents, they stayed where they were told. And yet the maps whispered otherwise. Let's pause here, Voyager. Imagine Ortelius in his candlelit study, hands ink-stained, elbow deep in vellum scrolls and brass instruments. Outside, the bells of Antwerp chime, calling time he refuses to notice. His world is still, except on the parchment before him. It isn't. The coasts bend inward like longing. The outlines drift in his mind, not yet breaking, but remembering how to move. He closes his eyes, sees Pangaea before the word existed, a supercontinent not in science, but in sleep. And he lets it sit there quietly between the annotations. He could never prove it, not then, but he planted a seed. Centuries later, in the early 1900s, a German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener would stumble across Ortelius' quiet speculation. Wegener too saw the jigsaw shapes. He added geology, fossil records, glacial scars. He named the process continental drift. People laughed at him, just as they had ignored Ortelius, but not forever. Eventually, with the rise of plate tectonics theory in the mid-20th century, the world caught up. Earth wasn't fixed. It flowed, cracked, shifted. The continents weren't nations, they were rafts, slowly, inexorably, moving over molten stone, exactly as Ortelius had once dreamed. But that's later. In his time, Ortelius remained a quiet cartographic caretaker. He revised his atlas multiple times, added new maps, removed outdated ones. He was obsessed with accuracy, but still respectful of myth. His maps didn't just record geography, they whispered of memory. Atlantis, Hyperborea, Prester John. He didn't erase them. He placed them gently alongside the real. A map, he believed, was not merely a chart. It was a theater, a stage for the world. And every page was part dream, part evidence, part belief, and part longing. Ortelius would often be found, bent over a page, whispering to himself in Latin, his quill tapping gently in rhythm, with the wind that rattled the leaded glass panes of his study. He believed in order, in the elegance of geometry, but he also believed that maps were not absolute. They were performances, glimpses of a shifting truth. And so, he didn't merely draw coastlines, he annotated them. Each page of his atlas had companion texts, called cartouches, nestled in margins like footnotes with poetic flair. These weren't just coordinates or trade winds. They were speculations, stories, bits of borrowed myth and keen-eyed observations, stitched together in delicate script. It was in one such note, buried near the edge of the Atlantic, that he gently posited his most curious belief, that the continents had once been joined, then torn asunder by ancient earthquakes and floods. He didn't claim divine vision. He simply wrote that it appeared so, like a thought that visits in a dream and leaves before it's questioned. It would take the world nearly 400 years to ask the same question out loud. Still, Ortelius' maps spread. The Theatrum Orbis Terrarum became a publishing marvel, revised over decades, translated into multiple languages, and held in the hands of kings, sailors, merchants, and monks. Some traced his coastlines with trembling fingers, preparing to leave home for the first time. Others stared at them for comfort, dreaming of a world more orderly than their own. But hidden in the lines were mysteries. Not all were solved. He included places that now seem like mirages. Friesland, an island southwest of Iceland, appears on many maps of the period, including Ortelius's. It was described in vivid detail, its settlements, its mountains, but no such island exists. Today we call it a phantom island, one born perhaps from error, perhaps from ice, perhaps from memory. He also charted Terra Australis Incognita, the great southern landmass that mapmakers believed must exist to balance the weight of the continents. This imaginary land would eventually give rise to Antarctica's discovery, though it looked little like what Ortelius had drawn. To modernize, these inclusions might seem like mistakes, but Ortelius was not wrong in the ways we think. He was capturing a world in flux. A map, he believed, was not a frozen truth, but a process of asking. He honored uncertainty. He gave it space on the page. It was this humility that would allow a single sentence in his notes to echo across centuries. The Americas appear to have been torn away from Europe and Africa, a thought as light as a feather, but as heavy as a continent. Imagine it, Voyager. The candle flickers low, the ink dries, the window rattles faintly in the Antwerp wind. Outside, the sea is black with midnight, but inside, the earth quietly rearranges itself on parchment, and somewhere beneath it all, the continents sleep, still dreaming of the days they touched. Now let us drift for a moment to the 20th century. It is 1912 and Alfred Wegener, a German scientist with a love for polar expeditions, stares at a world map with that same cartographer's tilt of the head. He's not the first to notice that the eastern edge of South America fits almost perfectly against the curve of West Africa, but he's the first to make the case publicly and seriously. He calls it continental drift. The idea is met with derision. Scientists scoff. There's no mechanism, no engine to explain how entire land masses could move. Wegener offers some theories, tidal forces, centrifugal push, but they are flimsy. Still, he insists, the fossil records line up. Rock formations match across oceans. This is no accident, he says. What Ortelius whispered, Wegener shouts. But the world isn't ready. Wegener dies on an expedition in Greenland in 1930, decades before his ideas are proven right. But like Ortelius, he plants a seed. By the 1960s, with the advent of seafloor mapping and plate tectonics, the theory is reborn, not as drift, but as a science of shifting plates. Suddenly, Ortelius's poetic guess becomes prophetic. He had no tools, no seismographs, no sonar, just a sharp eye, and the courage to suggest that maybe the Earth moves too. Back in the 16th century, Ortelius couldn't have known the phrase plate tectonics, but he understood something deeper, that the shape of the world is never final, that coastlines are stories in motion, that even maps, as precise as they try to be, are always a little bit wrong, and that wrongness is where imagination lives. It's easy to forget now, in the age of satellites and GPS, that maps were once handmade prayers. Each one, a quiet attempt to hold the world still, long enough to understand it. Ortelius never pretended his atlas was perfect. He simply wanted it to be honest, to acknowledge both what we know and what we still wonder. Take a moment, Voyager. Imagine his desk once more, the globe beside him, a piece of string wrapped around it, not measuring distance but possibility. The faint scratch of quill on parchment, a pause, a blink, and a sudden shift in thinking. What if the Earth doesn't stay still? What if it too dreams? Perhaps Ortelius never intended his suggestion to be taken as scientific fact. Perhaps he was only wondering aloud, the way one does late at night, staring at something for so long, it begins to breathe back. But in that wonder, he became a forerunner, a quiet cartographic philosopher, a man who dared to look at the world and see not just land and sea, but motion, history, memory, and something even softer, connection. Because when we trace the shapes of continents, we are also tracing our own desire to belong, to understand where we came from, to imagine, perhaps, that even when the Earth breaks apart, it remembers what it once held close. And sometimes a mapmaker is the only one listening. Ortelius never left Europe, not physically, but his imagination traveled farther than most ships of his time. Through borrowed accounts from explorers and merchants, through the letters of friends and colleagues, he pieced together the continents from careful listening. And perhaps that made his maps even more sincere, because they were less about conquest and more about curiosity. In his later editions, Ortelius included maps from around the world, not just his own. He published Arabic maps, Persian charts, Chinese depictions of the heavens. He believed that geography was not a single voice, but a quiet choir, one that sang in many tongues and still echoed the same question: where are we? He compiled legends too, tucked into the margins or woven into place names. Here, a sea serpent curls beside a ship. There, a land of pygmies whispered in a cartouche. He knew these might not be true in the way that mountains and rivers are true, but he also knew they meant something. They told us what people feared, or hoped, or imagined existed just beyond the visible world. And isn't that what maps are for? Even now, we measure space not only by miles but by meaning. A childhood street, a final resting place, a name carved into stone. These are the emotional topographies that lie just beneath every coastline. And Ortelius somehow seemed to know that. In the late autumn of his life, Ortelius returned to the beginning. He began revising his Paragon, a companion to his atlas, filled with historical maps. He redrew the Roman Empire, imagined the Exodus, outlined ancient Scythia. These were not places one could sail to, but they were real, in the sense that memory is real. He once wrote that history was the soul of geography, and perhaps he was right. Perhaps every modern map floats upon invisible layers, histories we can't see but still feel, like dust in the grain of a table. The Earth remembers, even when we forget. Abraham Ortelius died in 1598. He was buried in Antwerp, beneath the stone and spire of St. Michael's Abbey. A statue of him stands near the city zoo now, holding a globe, gazing forward with that same slightly puzzled, deeply curious expression that mapmakers often wear. But his real monument is quieter. It lives in the pages of atlases that still bear his name, in the worn corners of libraries, in the quiet reverence of hands tracing a coastline he once drew, and in every map that dares to say, not only this is where you are, but this is how we dreamed of finding our way. His legacy, though, stretches even farther. The idea that the earth is in motion, that its continents once touched, that its skin has drifted and cracked, would go on to shape geology, oceanography, even climate science. Ortelius didn't discover this truth, but he named it gently in ink. He gave it a place to rest until the world was ready to look again. And isn't that what dreaming really is? A way of holding possibility just long enough for it to become real. Let us pause here, Voyager, in the stillness of ink and silence. Imagine that map again, the one that began with a theater, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the theater of the world, a place not just to look, but to behold, to wonder. That is what Ortelius gave us. Not the perfect map, but the permission to imagine one. And if you're listening now from a quiet room, from a far coast, from coordinates not yet charted on any page, know this: you too are part of that theater. You too are a point on the map, and in some small, soft way, you are a continuation of his dream. So, let us bring our voyage gently to a close. The stars are out, faint and patient. The parchment is rolled. The globe turns slowly on its axis, like a thought returning home. Sleep now, Voyager. Let the earth drift quietly beneath you, and may your dreams be shaped like continents, touching, breaking, and always remembering.